The morning fog hung low over Falcon Ridge Air Force Base as Captain Rachel Torres adjusted her rearview mirror and caught sight of the weathered F-16C Fighting Falcon sitting alone on the far edge of the tarmac, while other pilots rushed toward. The sleek new F-35A Lightning IIs gleaming under the Montana sun. Rachel's eyes lingered on the older aircraft that everyone called a relic. What they didn't know was that this so-called obsolete fighter held secrets that could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe when the impossible became reality. In just hours, 20 enemy bombers would test everything she believed about warfare, loyalty, and the deadly cost of being right when everyone else is wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn air carried a sharp bite as retired Master Sergeant Frank Rodriguez pulled his pickup truck into the visitor parking area at Falcon Ridge Air Force Base. The annual Thunder Valley Air Show drew thousands of spectators each October, but Frank had come for more personal reasons. His granddaughter Rachel was somewhere on this base, flying missions he could barely imagine, carrying on a family tradition that stretched back 3 generations. At 78, Frank moved carefully across the gravel lot, his aluminum cane, helping him navigate the uneven ground while families with children hurried past toward the main exhibition area. The roar of jet engines echoed across the vast Montana landscape as demonstration flights began their practice runs overhead. Frank squinted against the morning glare, searching the sky for familiar silhouettes he'd spent 40 years maintaining. Fighters from Vietnam-era Phantoms to modern tactical aircraft, and he could identify most planes by sound alone. The high-pitched whine of the F-35s dominated the airspace, but somewhere in that mechanical symphony, he hoped to hear the distinctive growl of an F-16 engine. Frank hadn't told Rachel he was coming. Military families learned early that surprise visits could be complicated by operational schedules, security protocols, and the unpredictable demands of service life. But something had drawn him here beyond simple pride in his granddaughter's achievements. Letters from Rachel over the past months had carried an undercurrent of frustration that reminded him of his own struggles with commanding officers who valued conformity over competence. The military had changed dramatically since his era, but some challenges remained depressingly familiar. He found a spot near the flight line fence where he could watch aircraft operations without interfering with the airshow preparations. Base hummed with activity as ground crews performed final checks on demonstration aircraft while pilots completed their pre-flight briefings. Frank recognized the controlled chaos of military aviation, the careful choreography of procedures designed to prevent disasters in an inherently dangerous profession. Every movement had purpose, every checklist item carried the weight of lives. And million-dollar aircraft. A group of teenage visitors clustered near the fence, their attention focused on smartphones rather than the remarkable display of aviation technology surrounding them. Frank smiled at their distraction, remembering when air shows represented the pinnacle of excitement for young people fascinated by flight. Technology had shifted their focus to virtual experiences, but he still believed nothing could replace the visceral thrill of watching a fighter aircraft demonstrate its capabilities just overhead. What Frank couldn't see from his position was the heated discussion taking place in the Eagle Squadron briefing room, where his granddaughter was fighting a battle that had nothing to do with enemy aircraft. Captain Rachel Torres stood before a wall-mounted tactical display, her hand-annotated charts spread across the briefing table like evidence in a court case. The charts showed detailed analysis of radar coverage gaps, historical penetration routes used by reconnaissance aircraft, and weather patterns that could mask incoming threats. To Rachel, these patterns told a clear story about vulnerabilities in their current defense posture. To Colonel Michael Harrison, they represented an unwelcome challenge to established procedures. Colonel Harrison commanded Falcon Ridge with the confidence of someone who'd risen through ranks. During an era of technological superiority and overwhelming American air power. At 52, he built his reputation on implementing cutting-edge systems and modernizing aging infrastructure. The base's recent transition from legacy F-16s to advanced F-35 Lightning IIs represented the culmination of his vision for 21st century air defense. Digital integration, network sensors, and automated threat detection had replaced what he considered the crude manual methods of previous generations. Rachel's insistence on maintaining backup procedures and manual plotting capabilities struck Harrison as both unnecessary and professionally naive. At 29, she represented a generation that should embrace technological advancement rather than clinging to obsolete practices. Her service record showed exceptional flying skills and tactical knowledge, but her attitude toward modernization suggested someone stuck in the past. Harrison had tried patience, direct orders, and professional counseling, but Rachel continued advocating for what she called redundant capabilities. The morning briefing had started routinely enough, with weather updates, airspace restrictions for the airshow, and maintenance status reports. Rachel's problems began when she requested permission to address potential gaps in their northern radar coverage. Intelligence reports from the past week had indicated increased electronic reconnaissance activity along the Canadian border, suggesting foreign interest in their defensive capabilities. Rachel had spent her off-duty hours analyzing radar tracks and identifying patterns that troubled her. Colonel Harrison listened to her presentation with growing impatience. Rachel's concerns centered on limitations in their new integrated defense network, particularly its vulnerability to electronic jamming and its dependence on satellite communications. She prepared detailed charts showing how older radar systems provided overlapping coverage that could compensate for digital system failures. Her analysis was thorough, professional, and completely unwelcome. The other pilots in the briefing room watched this exchange with the uncomfortable awareness that careers could be damaged by association with unpopular opinions. Captain David Murphy and Lieutenant Mark Chun had flown with Rachel long enough to respect her tactical knowledge, but they also understood the importance of supporting their commander's vision. The F-35 program represented the future of air combat, and questioning its capabilities could be interpreted as questioning the Air Force's strategic direction. Rachel pressed her case with the methodical precision that made her an exceptional pilot, but a challenging subordinate. She pointed out that their legacy F-16S carried proven radar systems that operated independently of the networked architecture. While less sophisticated than modern equipment, these older systems were also less vulnerable to cyber attacks and electronic warfare. Her request to maintain a small number of F-16s in operational status as backup interceptors met with immediate resistance. Colonel Harrison's response reflected both professional frustration and institutional pressure. The Pentagon had invested billions in next-generation fighter capabilities, and local commanders were expected to demonstrate confidence in these systems. Maintaining older aircraft suggested doubt about technological progress and could be interpreted as resistance to official policy. Harrison had no intention of allowing one captain's concerns to undermine his base's reputation for embracing innovation. The briefing concluded with clear guidance that Rachel should focus on maximizing F-35 capabilities rather than advocating for obsolete alternatives. Her detailed analysis was noted, but not incorporated into operational planning. The implicit message was unmistakable. Conformity to established procedures was more important than individual concerns about potential vulnerabilities. Rachel gathered her charts with the familiar feeling of being professionally dismissed, despite providing valid technical analysis. As the formal briefing ended, several pilots approached Rachel privately to express support for her concerns. Master Sergeant Robert Kim, who operated the base's radar systems, had noticed the same vulnerabilities she'd identified. His 30 years of experience with electronic warfare told him that overconfidence in any single system could prove catastrophic. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, fresh from flight training, found Rachel's combination of technical knowledge and practical experience inspiring in a profession dominated by protocol and hierarchy. But private support meant little without official recognition. Rachel walked toward the flight line, knowing that her professional reputation was increasingly at odds with her technical convictions. The morning air show would display the capabilities of modern fighter aircraft to thousands of spectators, but none of them would see the institutional tensions that could determine whether those capabilities would be available when truly needed. Frank Rodriguez watched his granddaughter emerge from the operations building and walk toward the aircraft parking area. Even from a distance, he could read the tension in her posture, the way she carried herself when frustrated by circumstances beyond her control. He'd seen that same expression during her childhood, when adults dismissed her questions about how things worked or why certain procedures existed. Rachel had always possessed an engineer's mind coupled with a pilot's instincts, a combination that made her exceptionally capable, but sometimes difficult to manage. The F-16 sitting alone on the far side of the ramp looked identical to aircraft Frank had maintained decades earlier, but he knew it carried modern upgrades that enhanced its basic design. These fighters had proven themselves in combat around the world, accumulating an operational record that new aircraft would need years to match. There was wisdom in maintaining proven capabilities alongside cutting-edge technology, but institutional momentum favored the new over the reliable. Rachel performed her pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness that Frank had taught her during childhood visits to various airbases. She checked control surfaces, examined engine intakes, and verified that external stores were properly mounted. Her movements showed the confidence of someone completely comfortable with her aircraft, understanding not just how to operate its systems, but why they were designed as they were. This intimate knowledge of her equipment would prove crucial in the hours ahead, though neither she nor Frank could anticipate the test that was approaching. The air show demonstration flights continued overhead as Rachel completed her preparations. F-35s performed precision maneuvers that showcased their advanced capabilities, drawing appreciative responses from the crowd gathered along the flight line. These aircraft represented the pinnacle of fighter design, incorporating stealth technology, advanced sensors, and network integration that promised to dominate future battlefields. Their performance was impressive by any measure, and the pilots who flew them were among the most highly trained in the world. But beneath the impressive display of technological superiority, vulnerabilities existed that few people understood or acknowledged. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rachel's analysis had identified these weaknesses not through theoretical speculation, but through careful study of system limitations and historical precedents. Electronic warfare capabilities had evolved alongside defensive systems, creating new categories of threats that required adaptive responses rather than rigid adherence to standard procedures. As she climbed into her F-16's cockpit, Rachel carried more than just professional concerns about defensive gaps and system vulnerabilities. She carried the weight of knowing that being right about uncomfortable truths could be more dangerous to a military career than being wrong about popular assumptions. The institution rewarded confidence in official capabilities while punishing doubt about technological solutions. Individual officers who questioned established doctrine risked being labeled as disruptive influences regardless of their technical expertise. The engine startup sequence filled Rachel's helmet with familiar sounds as systems came online and displays illuminated with status information. This aircraft had been her assigned mount for 2 years, and she knew its particular characteristics as well as any pilot could. Every machine had unique quirks and capabilities that became apparent only through extensive operation under various conditions. Rachel's logbook showed hundreds of hours in this specific airframe, building the kind of intimate familiarity that made exceptional piloting possible. Frank watched the F-16's engine ignition from his position near the fence, recognizing the sight and sound of a well-maintained fighter coming to life. The aircraft taxied toward the active runway with the purposeful movement of a machine designed for combat rather than demonstration. While airshow visitors focused on the acrobatic displays overhead, Frank understood that Rachel's routine training flight represented the real backbone of air defense operations. These unglamorous sorties maintained pilot proficiency and equipment readiness that would be essential if genuine threats ever materialized. What none of them knew was that genuine threats were already in motion, approaching from the north at altitudes and speeds designed to test every assumption about modern air defense. 2295 Bear bombers had departed their bases hours earlier, following flight paths calculated to exploit weaknesses in radar coverage and challenge response capabilities. Their mission was reconnaissance rather than attack, but the distinction would matter little if defensive systems failed to detect and intercept them according to established protocols. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not just aircraft and equipment, but the fundamental question of whether institutional confidence in technology could overcome individual expertise in warfare. Rachel's F-16 represented more than an aging fighter aircraft. It embodied the accumulated wisdom of decades of combat experience and the proven value of redundant capabilities. The next few hours would determine whether that wisdom still had value in an era of digital integration and networked defense systems. As Rachel received clearance for takeoff and began her roll down the runway, her grandfather watched with the pride of someone who understood exactly what she was capable of achieving. He'd seen enough military careers to recognize both the promise and the perils of speaking truth to power. The afternoon would bring challenges that would test everything Rachel had learned about flying, fighting, and standing up for what she believed was right regardless of the personal cost. Rachel's F-16 climbed steadily through the crisp Montana morning air, leaving the airshow crowds and demonstration flights far below. At 15,000 feet, she leveled off and began her assigned patrol route along the northern border sector. The cockpit displays showed normal readings across all systems, but Rachel's attention focused on details that most pilots never bothered to monitor. She watched the subtle variations in radar return patterns, noting how atmospheric conditions affected sensor performance and how terrain features created shadows in their electronic coverage. During her 2 years at Falcon Ridge, Rachel had developed an almost obsessive understanding of their defensive sector's characteristics. She'd flown this route in every weather condition, at different times of day, and under various atmospheric circumstances. Where other pilots saw routine training missions, Rachel saw opportunities to map the invisible architecture of electromagnetic warfare. Her personal notebooks contained detailed observations about how radar systems performed under different conditions, information that wasn't captured in official technical manuals. The knowledge she'd accumulated came from an unusual combination of formal education and practical experience. Rachel held a master's degree in electrical engineering from the Air Force Institute of Technology, specializing in radar systems and electronic warfare. Her thesis had examined vulnerabilities in network defense architectures, research that proved prophetic but was largely ignored by commanders focused on the advantages of integration rather than its potential weaknesses. Academic knowledge alone wouldn't have been sufficient, but Rachel combined theoretical understanding with hundreds of hours of operational flying that gave her insights unavailable to either pure engineers or typical pilots. Her flight path today took her along the same route she'd flown dozens of times before, but Rachel never treated these missions as routine. She monitored radio frequencies used by civilian aircraft, noting any unusual activity that might indicate reconnaissance flights or electronic intelligence gathering. She tracked the performance of their own radar systems, identifying moments when coverage gaps appeared due to atmospheric ducting or equipment limitations. Most importantly, she observed patterns in electronic emissions that suggested foreign interest in their defensive capabilities. The 295 Bear reconnaissance flights that had been probing their airspace over the past month followed predictable patterns that Rachel had carefully documented. These massive turboprop bombers appeared at irregular intervals, approaching just close enough to trigger defensive responses before turning away and disappearing back into international airspace. Intelligence analysts classified these flights as routine training missions, but Rachel suspected they served a more sophisticated purpose of mapping American defensive reactions and identifying operational procedures. Rachel's analysis suggested that these probe flights were specifically designed to test response times, communication protocols, and the integration between different defensive systems. The foreign aircraft approached at altitudes and speeds that required immediate responses, forcing defensive networks to operate at maximum capacity while revealing their operational characteristics. Each probe flight provided valuable intelligence about American capabilities and procedures, information that could prove crucial if genuine hostile intent ever replaced mere reconnaissance. The problem was that Rachel's concerns fell outside normal intelligence channels and weren't supported by the kind of classified information that would make them officially credible. Her observations came from careful analysis of publicly available flight tracks and her own operational experience, sources that carried little weight compared to formal intelligence assessments. When she'd attempted to brief her concerns to higher headquarters, she'd been politely dismissed as an overly anxious junior officer seeing threats where none existed. Colonel Harrison's resistance to her analysis reflected broader institutional attitudes about individual initiative and official channels for threat assessment. The Air Force maintained sophisticated intelligence organizations staffed by professionals whose job was to identify and evaluate potential threats. Local commanders weren't expected to conduct independent analysis, particularly when that analysis questioned the effectiveness of officially approved systems and procedures. Rachel's persistence in raising concerns outside her assigned responsibilities marked her as someone who didn't understand proper boundaries between individual duties and institutional functions. The irony was that Rachel's engineering background and operational experience made her uniquely qualified to identify the specific vulnerabilities she discovered. Most intelligence analysts lacked detailed technical knowledge about radar systems and electronic warfare, while most pilots lacked the analytical skills to recognize patterns in complex data. Rachel's combination of capabilities allowed her to see connections that escaped both groups, but it also made her conclusions difficult to validate through normal channels. As she continued her patrol route, Rachel monitored multiple radio frequencies, simultaneously listening for the subtle signs of electronic intelligence gathering that preceded actual military operations. Foreign reconnaissance aircraft often conducted extensive electronic mapping before attempting penetration flights, building detailed pictures of defensive networks and identifying optimal approach routes. The increase in electronic activity over the past week suggested that something more significant than routine training might be planned. Her F-16's radar warning receiver detected the routine emissions from their own defensive systems, but Rachel had learned to distinguish between normal operational patterns and the slight variations that indicated system stress or unusual activity. Today's reading showed fluctuations that troubled her, suggesting that their integrated defense network was experiencing intermittent connectivity issues that could create temporary gaps in coverage. These gaps lasted only minutes at a time, but they represented windows of vulnerability that sophisticated adversaries might exploit. The technical details of these vulnerabilities were complex, involving interactions between satellite communications, ground-based radar systems, and the network protocols that tied everything together. Rachel's engineering education allowed her to understand how cyber attacks or electronic jamming could disrupt these connections, creating cascading failures that would degrade overall defensive effectiveness. Her operational experience showed her how these theoretical vulnerabilities translated into real tactical situations where split-second decisions determined success or failure. Rachel's radio crackled with routine communications from other aircraft in their sector, but she noted the absence of any mention of her concerns in official briefings or coordination messages. The command structure operated as if the integrated defense network was functioning perfectly, with no acknowledgement of the intermittent issues she'd been reporting for weeks. This institutional blindness to potential problems reflected a broader pattern of overconfidence in technological solutions and resistance to uncomfortable warnings about system limitations. The landscape below showed the rugged terrain that made this sector particularly challenging for radar coverage. Mountain peaks and deep valleys created natural obstacles that clever adversaries could exploit to mask their approach routes. Rachel had spent considerable time studying topographical maps and correlating them with radar coverage patterns, identifying specific corridors where low-flying aircraft might penetrate undetected. Her analysis showed that traditional manual plotting methods could compensate for these geographic limitations, but only if operators understood the terrain well enough to anticipate likely penetration routes. As her patrol continued, Rachel thought about the broader implications of the institutional resistance she'd encountered. Military organizations necessarily emphasize standardization and adherence to established procedures, qualities essential for coordinating complex operations involving thousands of personnel and billions of dollars worth of equipment. Individual initiative was valued in combat situations, but questioning fundamental assumptions about equipment and procedures challenged the predictability that large organizations required to function effectively. The tension between individual expertise and institutional requirements created ongoing challenges for officers like Rachel, who possessed specialized knowledge that didn't fit neatly into official categories. Her engineering background gave her insights into system vulnerabilities that most military personnel couldn't evaluate, while her operational experience provided context that academic analysts often lacked. But translating this knowledge into actionable recommendations required navigating bureaucratic processes designed to prevent individual opinions from disrupting established procedures. Rachel's frustration stemmed not from ego or personal ambition, but from genuine concern about defensive gaps that could prove catastrophic if exploited by sophisticated adversaries. Her analysis indicated specific vulnerabilities in their integrated defense network, but institutional momentum favored confidence in officially approved capabilities over individual warnings about potential problems. The question was whether her concerns would be validated through successful operations or through the kind of crisis that made prevention impossible. The morning briefing room at Falcon Ridge buzzed with the controlled energy of pilots preparing for another day of routine operations. Captain David Murphy arrived early, claiming his usual seat near the front where he could demonstrate his engagement with Colonel Harrison's presentations. Lieutenant Mark Chen followed shortly after, carrying a tablet loaded with the latest tactical publications and software updates. The room gradually filled with the 17 pilots assigned to Eagle Squadron, each bringing their own combination of ambition, competence, and political awareness that determined success in military aviation. Rachel entered the briefing room precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio that contained her hand-annotated charts and analysis reports. While other pilots relied increasingly on digital displays and network information systems, Rachel maintained detailed paper records that allowed her to identify patterns that electronic systems might miss. Her portfolio had become something of a running joke among her colleagues, who referred to it as her security blanket or her analog backup system. The mockery was generally good-natured, but it reflected underlying skepticism about her methods and priorities. Colonel Harrison began the briefing with his customary review of weather conditions, airspace restrictions, and maintenance status. Updates. His presentation style emphasized efficiency and technological integration, highlighting how modern systems provided comprehensive, situational awareness that previous generations of pilots could never have imagined. The integrated defense network displayed real-time threats across multiple sensor platforms, creating a digital battlefield picture that theoretically eliminated surprises and coordination failures. Rachel listened carefully to the official briefing, comparing the optimistic assessments with her own observations about system performance and reliability. The Colonel's presentation made no mention of the intermittent connectivity issues she'd been documenting, nor did it acknowledge the electronic reconnaissance activity that had increased significantly over the past month. The official picture portrayed their defensive sector as fully capable and completely prepared for any conceivable threat scenario. When Colonel Harrison opened the floor for questions and concerns, Rachel saw her opportunity to address the vulnerabilities she'd identified. She stood and requested permission to brief the squadron on potential gaps in radar coverage and recommended procedures for manual backup systems. Her request was professional and properly formatted, following established protocols for introducing topics during official briefings. She expected a normal discussion of technical issues, not the immediate resistance that characterized Harrison's response. The Colonel's expression hardened as Rachel outlined her concerns about the integrated defense network's vulnerability to electronic warfare and cyber attacks. Her analysis was detailed and technically sound, supported by specific examples of system failures during recent exercises and documented instances of connectivity problems that had temporarily degraded their defensive coverage. She recommended maintaining proficiency in manual plotting techniques and keeping legacy radar systems operational as backup capabilities. Harrison's dismissal came swift and categorical. He interrupted Rachel's presentation to emphasize that their integrated defense network represented the pinnacle of modern military technology, incorporating redundancies and safeguards that made the kind of failure she described virtually impossible. Her concerns about electronic warfare reflected outdated thinking from an era when defensive systems lacked the sophistication and integration that characterized current capabilities. The Colonel's response revealed deeper institutional attitudes about technological progress and individual questioning of official capabilities. Expressing doubt about integrated defense networks implied criticism of the substantial investments and strategic decisions that had created these systems. Local commanders weren't expected to second-guess Pentagon acquisition programs or question the fundamental assumptions underlying modern air defense architecture. Rachel's persistence in raising these concerns marked her as someone who didn't understand the broader context of military modernization. Other pilots in the briefing room watched this exchange with uncomfortable awareness that careers could be affected by association with unpopular positions. Captain Murphy had worked closely with Rachel on several training missions and respected her technical knowledge, but he also understood the importance of supporting their commander's vision and maintaining squadron unity. Publicly agreeing with Rachel's concerns would risk being labeled as part of a disruptive faction that questioned established procedures and technological progress. Lieutenant Chun represented the newer generation of pilots who had trained exclusively on integrated systems and had limited experience with manual backup procedures. His education emphasized networked warfare and digital integration, concepts that made Rachel's focus on analog backup systems seem obsolete and professionally backward. Chun's generation trusted technology implicitly, having never operated during an era when equipment failures and communication breakdowns were routine parts of military operations. The briefing room's atmosphere grew tense as Rachel attempted to explain the technical details of her analysis, only to be repeatedly interrupted by Colonel Harrison's assertions that modern systems had eliminated the vulnerabilities she described. Her references to historical examples of system failures were dismissed as irrelevant to contemporary capabilities, while her recommendations for manual backup procedures were characterized as wasteful allocation of training time that should be devoted to maximizing integrated system capabilities. Rachel's frustration became evident as she realized that technical arguments were being rejected not on their merits but because they challenged institutional confidence in official capabilities. Her engineering background and operational experience gave her insights that other squadron members couldn't easily evaluate, but this specialized knowledge became a liability when it contradicted popular assumptions about technological reliability. The briefing room dynamics made clear that questioning integrated defense networks was professionally unacceptable regardless of technical justification. Master Sergeant Robert Kim, who operated the base's radar systems from the enlisted perspective, watched this exchange with growing concern. His 30 years of experience with electronic warfare and system maintenance had taught him that overconfidence in any technology could prove catastrophic when adversaries specifically targeted those systems. Kim had observed the same intermittent connectivity issues that Rachel described, but enlisted personnel weren't expected to participate in officer briefings about strategic threats and defensive capabilities. The colonel concluded the discussion by directing Rachel to focus her efforts on maximizing F-35 capabilities rather than advocating for obsolete alternatives that diverted resources from modern priorities. Her detailed analysis would be noted in squadron records, but it wouldn't influence operational planning or training requirements. The implicit message was clear. Conformity to established procedures was more important than individual concerns about potential vulnerabilities, regardless of technical expertise or supporting evidence. As the briefing concluded and pilots dispersed to their assigned missions, Rachel gathered her materials with the familiar feeling of professional isolation that came from being technically correct but institutionally unwelcome. Several colleagues approached her privately to express support for her concerns, but private sympathy carried little weight compared to official dismissal. The squadron's culture emphasized unity and confidence in approved capabilities, qualities that made questioning those capabilities a form of disloyalty. Rachel's walk to the flight line reflected the broader challenge facing military professionals who possessed specialized knowledge that contradicted popular assumptions. Institutional momentum favored confidence and conformity over individual warnings about potential problems, creating environments where technical expertise became professionally dangerous when it produced uncomfortable conclusions. The question was whether these dynamics would change through successful operations or through the kind of crisis that made prevention impossible. Colonel Michael Harrison's office reflected his vision of modern military leadership through its integration of cutting-edge technology and streamlined efficiency. Multiple displays showed real-time status updates from across Falcon Ridge Air Force Base, while network terminals provided instant access to intelligence reports, personnel records, and operational databases. The office embodied Harrison's belief that information superiority and technological integration were the keys to maintaining American air dominance in an increasingly complex global environment. At 52, Harrison had built his career during the transition from Cold War-era aviation to the digital age of networked warfare. His early assignments had involved flying F-15 Eagles during the final years of the Soviet threat, but his most significant achievements came through managing the implementation of integrated defense systems and next-generation fighter programs. Harrison understood that modern air combat required seamless coordination between multiple platforms and sensor networks rather than the individual heroics that had characterized earlier eras. The colonel's management philosophy emphasized standardization, technological adoption, and institutional confidence in officially approved capabilities. Falcon Ridge had become a model installation under his command, successfully transitioning from legacy F-16 operations to the advanced F-35. Lightning II program while maintaining operational readiness and safety standards. Harrison's reputation within the Air Force reflected his ability to implement complex modernization programs while managing the human challenges that accompanied technological change. Rachel Torres represented exactly the kind of challenge that Harrison found most frustrating in contemporary military leadership. Her technical competence was undeniable, as evidenced by her engineering education, flight qualifications, and operational performance. But her persistent questioning of integrated defense capabilities suggested someone who didn't understand the broader strategic context of military modernization or the importance of maintaining institutional confidence in approved systems and procedures. Harrison's resistance to Rachel's analysis reflected genuine concern about the corrosive effects of individual doubt on organizational effectiveness. Military units required confidence in their equipment and procedures to function effectively under stress, and persistent questioning of fundamental capabilities could undermine the unit cohesion essential for successful operations. Rachel's warnings about system vulnerabilities, regardless of their technical merit, threatened the positive command climate that Harrison had worked years to establish. The colonel's experience with previous modernization programs had taught him that technological transitions always generated resistance from personnel comfortable with older systems and procedures. F-35 implementation had faced similar challenges at other installations, where experienced pilots expressed skepticism about new capabilities and nostalgia for familiar aircraft. Harrison viewed Rachel's advocacy for manual backup systems and legacy radar capabilities as part of this predictable pattern of resistance to change. More troubling was Rachel's tendency to conduct independent analysis outside normal intelligence channels and established procedures for threat assessment. The Air Force maintained sophisticated organizations staffed by professionals whose specific responsibility was identifying and evaluating potential threats to American defensive capabilities. Local commanders weren't expected to develop their own intelligence assessments, particularly when those assessments questioned the effectiveness of officially approved systems and strategic decisions made at much higher levels. Harrison's phone rang with a call from Brigadier General Patricia Williams at North American Aerospace Defense Command Headquarters, interrupting his review of Rachel's latest analysis report. General Williams had received copies of Rachel's warnings about integrated defense network vulnerabilities through unofficial channels, creating the kind of higher-level attention that Harrison preferred to avoid. Military careers could be damaged by having subordinates generate concern at senior levels about local command decisions and capability assessments. The general's questions focused on the technical details of Rachel's analysis and the command's response to her recommendations about manual backup procedures and legacy system maintenance. Harrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending his dismissal of warnings that might prove prophetic, while explaining why his most technically qualified pilot was being marginalized rather than consulted on defensive capabilities. The conversation revealed the broader institutional tensions between local command authority and individual expertise. Harrison's explanation emphasized the importance of maintaining confidence in officially approved capabilities while preventing individual concerns from undermining unit effectiveness and morale. Rachel's analysis, regardless of its technical merit, represented the kind of questioning that could erode the institutional unity essential for military effectiveness. Modern air defense required seamless integration between multiple systems and platforms, integration that depended on confidence in approved procedures rather than individual improvisation. General Williams listened carefully to Harrison's justification, but her questions revealed skepticism about dismissing technically sound analysis from qualified personnel. The general's experience with intelligence failures and system breakdowns had taught her that overconfidence in technology could prove as dangerous as excessive skepticism. Her final guidance was clear: maintain readiness for all contingencies, while ensuring that valid technical concerns received appropriate consideration regardless of their source. After ending the call, Harrison reviewed Rachel's personnel file, with new attention to the broader implications of her presence in his command. Her technical qualifications were exceptional, including advanced degrees and specialized training that made her one of the most knowledgeable pilots in electronic warfare and radar systems. But her pattern of questioning established procedures and advocating for alternatives to approved capabilities made her a potential liability in an organization that valued predictability and institutional loyalty. The colonel's dilemma reflected broader challenges facing military leaders who needed to balance individual expertise with organizational requirements for standardization and confidence in approved capabilities. Rachel's warnings about integrated defense network vulnerabilities might prove accurate, but implementing her recommendations would require acknowledging fundamental limitations in systems that represented billions of dollars in investment and years of strategic planning. Harrison's decision to marginalize Rachel's influence reflected calculated assessment of institutional priorities and career considerations. Supporting her analysis risked associating his command with criticism of higher-level decisions about technological capabilities and strategic priorities. Dismissing her concerns maintained alignment with official optimism about integrated defense networks while avoiding the kind of questions that could damage his reputation for positive leadership and technological innovation. The colonel spent the remainder of the morning reviewing operational procedures and training schedules, ensuring that squadron activities reflected confidence in F-35 capabilities and integrated defense networks. Rachel's next flight assignment would focus on standard proficiency training, rather than the independent analysis missions that had allowed her to develop her controversial conclusions about system vulnerabilities. The message was clear: conformity to established procedures was more important than individual expertise, when that expertise produced uncomfortable questions about institutional capabilities. As Harrison prepared for his afternoon meetings with visiting Pentagon officials, he reflected on the broader implications of managing personnel who possessed specialized knowledge that contradicted popular assumptions. Military organizations necessarily emphasized unity and confidence in approved capabilities, qualities that made individual questioning a potential threat to operational effectiveness. The challenge was maintaining institutional cohesion while ensuring that valid technical concerns received appropriate attention before they became operational failures. The afternoon meetings would focus on Falcon Ridge's successful implementation of integrated defense capabilities and next-generation fighter programs, presentations that emphasized technological superiority and seamless operational integration. Rachel's warnings about system vulnerabilities would not be mentioned, maintaining the positive narrative that supported continued investment in advanced capabilities. The question was whether this institutional optimism would be validated through successful operations or challenged by the kind of crisis that made prevention impossible. The squadron-ready room fell silent as Rachel entered, carrying her flight gear and the leather portfolio that had become her professional signature. The conversations that had been flowing freely among the dozen pilots present shifted to subdued exchanges and meaningful glances, creating the kind of social isolation that accompanied professional controversies in close-knit military units. Rachel's confrontation with Colonel Harrison during the morning briefing had already become squadron legend, discussed in hushed tones that revealed both sympathy for her technical expertise and concern about her career prospects. Captain David Murphy looked up from his tablet as Rachel claimed an empty chair near the flight planning station. Murphy had flown wing position with Rachel on numerous training missions and had developed genuine respect for her tactical knowledge and flying skills. But her persistent questioning of integrated defense capabilities had created an uncomfortable dynamic where supporting her positions risked being labeled as part of a disruptive faction that questioned established procedures and institutional priorities. Lieutenant Mark Chun represented the broader generational divide that characterized Rachel's isolation within the squadron. Chun's training had emphasized digital integration and networked warfare, concepts that made Rachel's focus on manual backup systems and legacy capabilities seem professionally backward. His generation trusted technology implicitly and viewed skepticism about advanced capabilities as resistance to progress rather than prudent contingency planning. Chun's respect for Rachel's flying skills was genuine, but her analytical conclusions challenged fundamental assumptions about modern air combat. The social dynamics in the ready room reflected broader patterns of institutional pressure that discouraged individual questioning of approved capabilities and procedures. Military aviation was inherently conservative, emphasizing standardization and proven methods over innovation and individual interpretation. Rachel's advocacy for alternative approaches to integrated defense networks violated these cultural norms, marking her as someone who didn't understand proper boundaries between individual expertise and institutional authority. Staff Sergeant Lisa Johnson, who maintained Rachel's F-16, approached with maintenance logs that required pilot signature and review. Johnson's 20 years of aircraft maintenance had taught her to recognize the difference between pilots who truly understood their equipment and those who simply operated according to established procedures. Rachel's pre-flight inspections were among the most thorough Johnson had ever observed, revealing intimate knowledge of aircraft systems and potential failure modes that typical pilots never considered. The maintenance sergeant's conversation with Rachel provided temporary relief from the social isolation that pervaded her interactions with fellow pilots. Johnson had observed the same intermittent system problems that Rachel documented in her analysis reports, but enlisted personnel weren't expected to participate in discussions about strategic threats and defensive capabilities. The technical details of radar system vulnerabilities and network integration problems were outside Johnson's official responsibilities, but her practical experience with equipment maintenance gave her insights that supported Rachel's concerns. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez represented the small minority of squadron personnel who openly supported Rachel's analytical approach to defensive planning. Rodriguez's recent graduation from the Air Force Academy had included extensive coursework in systems, engineering, and electronic warfare, providing her with the technical background necessary to understand Rachel's warnings about integrated defense network vulnerabilities. But Rodriguez's junior status and recent arrival at Falcon Ridge limited her influence on squadron culture and operational procedures. The isolation Rachel experienced wasn't limited to professional disagreements about technical capabilities and strategic priorities. Her personal relationships within the squadron had been strained by the perception that she was unnecessarily critical of institutional decisions and resistant to the collaborative spirit that characterized successful military units. Social events and informal gatherings increasingly excluded Rachel, creating the kind of personal isolation that accompanied professional controversies in close-knit organizations. Master Sergeant Robert Kim, who operated radar systems from the enlisted perspective, watched Rachel's isolation with growing concern about the broader implications for defensive effectiveness. Kim's 30 years of experience with electronic warfare had taught him that diverse perspectives and questioning assumptions were essential for maintaining operational readiness against sophisticated adversaries. Rachel's warnings about system vulnerabilities reflected exactly the kind of critical thinking that prevented complacency and overconfidence from becoming operational weaknesses. The squadron's treatment of Rachel revealed institutional patterns that discouraged individual expertise when it contradicted popular assumptions about technological capabilities and strategic priorities. Military organizations necessarily emphasized unity and confidence in approved procedures, but this emphasis could become counterproductive when it prevented valid technical concerns from receiving appropriate consideration. Rachel's isolation reflected the tension between individual knowledge and institutional requirements for standardization and predictability. Rachel's attempts to share her analysis with fellow pilots met with polite but clear resistance that reflected both professional caution and genuine skepticism about her conclusions. Most squadron personnel lacked the technical background necessary to evaluate her warnings about integrated defense network vulnerabilities, making them dependent on institutional guidance about the reliability of approved systems and procedures. This dependence created environments where questioning official capabilities became professionally dangerous regardless of technical merit. The lunch period in the squadron dining facility provided another demonstration of Rachel's social isolation. As conversations stopped when she approached tables occupied by fellow pilots, the awkward silences and forced politeness that characterized these interactions reflected broader concerns about being associated with someone who had challenged institutional confidence in approved capabilities. Military careers could be affected by perceived alignment with unpopular positions, creating incentives for social distancing that reinforced professional isolation. Rachel's isolation extended beyond immediate squadron relationships to encompass broader professional networks and career development opportunities. Mentor relationships and informal guidance systems that were essential for military career progression became unavailable when individual reputations were associated with questioning institutional decisions and challenging established procedures. The professional consequences of technical expertise became apparent when that expertise produced conclusions that contradicted popular assumptions about organizational capabilities. The afternoon flight schedule assigned Rachel to routine proficiency missions rather than the analytical flights that had allowed her to develop her controversial conclusions about defensive vulnerabilities. This scheduling reflected Colonel Harrison's guidance that her activity should focus on standard training objectives rather than independent analysis that questioned approved capabilities and procedures. The message was clear: conformity to established requirements was more important than individual expertise when that expertise produced uncomfortable warnings about institutional limitations. As Rachel prepared for her assigned mission, she reflected on the broader implications of professional isolation for military effectiveness and individual career survival. Her technical analysis was sound, and her concerns about defensive vulnerabilities were valid, but institutional momentum favored confidence over questioning and unity over individual expertise. The challenge was maintaining professional integrity while adapting to organizational requirements that made technical knowledge a potential liability when it contradicted popular assumptions. The squadron's social dynamics created a feedback loop where Rachel's isolation reinforced perceptions that her analytical approach was divisive and counterproductive, while her continued advocacy for alternative defensive procedures confirmed suspicions that she didn't understand proper boundaries between individual concerns and institutional authority. This cycle of isolation and resistance made it increasingly difficult for Rachel to influence operational planning or share insights that might prove crucial for defensive effectiveness. Rachel's walk to the flight line reflected the personal cost of possessing specialized knowledge that challenged institutional confidence in approved capabilities and procedures. Military organizations required unity and confidence to function effectively, but these requirements could become counterproductive when they prevented valid technical expertise from contributing to operational readiness. The question was whether institutional dynamics would change through successful operations or through the kind of crisis that made individual expertise essential for organizational survival. The secure communications facility at Falcon Ridge hummed with electronic activity as overnight intelligence reports filtered through encrypted channels from monitoring stations across the northern border region. Master Sergeant Robert Kim arrived for his early morning shift to find message traffic that confirmed his worst suspicions about foreign reconnaissance activity. 3 separate electronic intelligence gathering flights had probed American defensive networks during the previous 12 hours, testing response times and mapping communication protocols with the methodical precision of pre-operational planning. Kim's 3 decades of experience with radar systems and electronic warfare had taught him to recognize the signatures of sophisticated intelligence operations. The overnight activity showed clear evidence of coordinated probing designed to identify vulnerabilities in integrated defense networks and establish optimal approach routes for potential penetration missions. Each probe flight had approached from different vectors, forcing defensive systems to respond at maximum capacity, while revealing operational characteristics that could be exploited by future missions. The technical details of these reconnaissance flights troubled Kim more than their frequency or coordination. Foreign aircraft were using advanced electronic warfare techniques that specifically targeted the network integration protocols that made modern air defense systems vulnerable to cascading failures. By jamming satellite communications at precise moments and introducing false signals into radar networks, the reconnaissance flights were demonstrating capabilities that could disable entire defensive sectors through coordinated cyber and electronic attacks. Kim's analysis of the overnight intelligence reports revealed patterns that supported every concern Rachel Torres had been raising about integrated defense network vulnerabilities. The foreign reconnaissance flights were specifically testing the same system integration points that Rachel had identified as potential failure modes in her technical analysis. More concerning, the probing flights had successfully induced temporary communication failures that created exactly the kind of coverage gaps that Rachel's manual backup procedures were designed to prevent. The correlation between Rachel's warnings and observable enemy activities was so clear that Kim felt compelled to document the connection in his official intelligence summary. His report detailed how foreign reconnaissance flights were exploiting specific vulnerabilities in network integration protocols, creating temporary defensive gaps that could be widened through more sophisticated attacks. Kim's analysis recommended immediate implementation of backup communication procedures and manual plotting capabilities to maintain defensive coverage during electronic warfare attacks. When Kim submitted his intelligence summary through normal channels, he expected it to generate immediate concern about defensive vulnerabilities and urgent requests for enhanced countermeasures. Instead, his report disappeared into the intelligence bureaucracy without acknowledgement or response. Follow-up inquiries were met with assurances that appropriate agencies were reviewing the information and that local installations should maintain confidence in approved defensive capabilities. The institutional response to Kim's analysis reflected broader patterns of resistance to intelligence that contradicted optimistic assessments of American technological superiority. Intelligence organizations at higher levels were heavily invested in integrated defense networks and reluctant to acknowledge fundamental vulnerabilities that would require expensive modifications or alternative approaches. Kim's warnings about electronic warfare capabilities joined a growing file of uncomfortable intelligence that was noted but not acted upon. Meanwhile, Rachel's routine patrol flights continued to document the same electronic reconnaissance activity that Kim was reporting through intelligence channels. Her observations from the cockpit provided tactical details about foreign aircraft behavior and electronic warfare techniques that weren't available through ground-based monitoring systems. Rachel's flight logs contained precise information about reconnaissance aircraft flight patterns, electronic emissions, and coordination between multiple probe flights that revealed sophisticated operational planning. The combination of Kim's ground-based intelligence analysis and Rachel's airborne observations created a comprehensive picture of foreign reconnaissance activities that clearly demonstrated preparation for potential offensive operations. Foreign intelligence services were methodically mapping American defensive capabilities while testing specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited through coordinated cyber and electronic warfare attacks. The reconnaissance activity showed all the characteristics of pre-operational planning rather than routine training exercises. Despite this overwhelming evidence of sophisticated threat activity, official briefings at Falcon Ridge continued to emphasize confidence in integrated defense capabilities while minimizing concerns about electronic warfare vulnerabilities. Colonel Harrison's daily operational summaries made no mention of the increasing reconnaissance activity or the demonstrated capabilities of foreign electronic warfare systems. The official narrative maintained that American technological superiority provided adequate protection against any conceivable threat scenario. The disconnect between observable threat activity and official assessments created growing frustration among personnel who understood the technical implications of foreign reconnaissance capabilities. Rachel's warnings about system vulnerabilities were being validated by enemy actions, but institutional momentum prevented this validation from influencing operational planning or defensive preparations. The intelligence was available, the analysis was sound, but the institutional capacity to acknowledge uncomfortable truths remained absent. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, who had been following Rachel's analysis with professional interest, began conducting her own research into electronic warfare capabilities and integrated defense network vulnerabilities. Rodriguez's engineering background from the Air Force Academy provided her with the technical knowledge necessary to understand the implications of foreign reconnaissance activities and the potential consequences of defensive system failures during coordinated attacks. Rodriguez's independent analysis confirmed Rachel's conclusions about the vulnerability of integrated defense networks to sophisticated electronic warfare techniques. More troubling, Rodriguez discovered that similar vulnerabilities had been exploited successfully in recent conflicts where technologically advanced militaries had been defeated by adversaries using coordinated cyber and electronic attacks. The historical precedent suggested that overconfidence in technological solutions could prove catastrophic when facing enemies who specifically targeted those technological advantages. The pattern of institutional resistance to uncomfortable intelligence extended beyond Falcon Ridge to encompass broader Air Force and Pentagon attitudes about technological capabilities and strategic threats. Recent congressional testimony by senior military leaders had emphasized American superiority in networked warfare and integrated defense systems, while dismissing concerns about electronic warfare vulnerabilities as outdated thinking from previous technological eras. This institutional optimism reflected genuine achievements in military technology and legitimate confidence in American capabilities. But it also created environments where questioning those capabilities became professionally dangerous regardless of technical merit. Officers who raised concerns about system vulnerabilities risked being labeled as pessimistic or resistant to progress. Career consequences that discourage the kind of critical thinking essential for maintaining operational readiness against sophisticated adversaries. Master Sergeant Johnson, who maintained Rachel's F-16, began documenting equipment performance anomalies that correlated with the increased electronic reconnaissance activity. Johnson's maintenance log showed subtle degradation in radio, communications and radar system performance that coincided with foreign probe flights, suggesting that even passive reconnaissance operations were affecting American equipment through electronic interference techniques. The maintenance data provided additional confirmation of Rachel's warnings about the vulnerability of modern systems to electronic warfare attacks. Johnson's technical expertise with aircraft systems allowed her to recognize performance degradation that less experienced personnel might dismiss as normal equipment variation. Her documentation created an additional source of evidence supporting concerns about defensive vulnerabilities and the need for backup procedures. The accumulating evidence from multiple sources created an increasingly clear picture of sophisticated threat activities and demonstrated vulnerabilities in American defensive systems. Kim's intelligence analysis, Rachel's operational observations, Rodriguez's technical research, and Johnson's maintenance data all pointed toward the same conclusions about foreign reconnaissance capabilities and integrated defense network weaknesses. The evidence was overwhelming, diverse, and technically sound. Yet institutional responses remained focused on maintaining confidence in approved capabilities rather than addressing demonstrated vulnerabilities. The pattern of consequences that Rachel had predicted was beginning to manifest through observable enemy activities and measurable degradation in defensive system performance. Foreign adversaries were systematically exploiting the same weaknesses that Rachel had identified. While American commanders continued to dismiss concerns about those weaknesses as unfounded pessimism, the morning briefing that followed Kim's latest intelligence summary provided another demonstration of institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths. Colonel Harrison reviewed overnight activities without mentioning the sophisticated electronic reconnaissance operations that had tested American defensive networks. His presentation emphasized routine training missions and normal operational activities, while avoiding any discussion of foreign intelligence gathering or demonstrated electronic warfare capabilities. Rachel attended the briefing with growing awareness that institutional dynamics were preventing critical intelligence from influencing operational planning and defensive preparations. Her technical analysis had predicted exactly the kind of reconnaissance activities that were now being observed and documented by multiple sources. The validation of her concerns should have resulted in enhanced defensive measures and implementation of backup procedures. But institutional momentum continued to favor confidence over caution. The briefing concluded with standard guidance about maintaining operational readiness and confidence in integrated defense capabilities. No mention was made of backup procedures, manual plotting techniques, or alternative communication methods that could maintain defensive coverage during electronic warfare attacks. The official position remained that modern systems provided adequate protection against any conceivable threat, despite mounting evidence that sophisticated adversaries were specifically targeting those systems. As pilots dispersed to their assigned missions, Rachel reflected on the broader implications of institutional resistance to validated intelligence and demonstrated threats. The pattern of consequences she had predicted was unfolding exactly as her analysis had suggested, but institutional capacity to acknowledge and respond to those consequences remained limited by investments in technological solutions and resistance to alternative approaches. The question was whether institutional learning would occur through gradual recognition of problems or through the kind of crisis that made prevention impossible. Colonel Harrison's private office felt smaller than usual as he reviewed the personnel evaluation form that would determine Rachel Torres's career prospects for the next several years. The document represented more than routine administrative paperwork. It embodied his growing frustration with an officer who seemed incapable of understanding appropriate boundaries between individual expertise and institutional authority. Rachel's persistent questioning of integrated defense capabilities had evolved from professional disagreement into what Harrison perceived as deliberate insubordination. The evaluation form's standardized categories provided multiple opportunities to document patterns of behavior that suggested unsuitability for continued service in critical positions. Harrison's careful wording emphasized Rachel's tendency to question established procedures, her resistance to technological modernization, and her inability to function effectively within normal command structures. Each comment was professionally phrased and technically accurate, but collectively they painted a picture of an officer whose judgment and reliability were fundamentally compromised. Harrison's assessment focused particularly on Rachel's unauthorized intelligence analysis and her attempts to influence operational planning through unofficial channels. Military organizations required predictable command relationships, and establish procedures for information flow, both of which Rachel had violated through her independent research and direct communication with personnel outside normal chains of command. Her behavior suggested someone who didn't understand the importance of institutional discipline and standardized approaches to complex problems. The Colonel's evaluation included specific examples of Rachel's disruptive influence on squadron morale and unit cohesion. Her public questioning of integrated defense capabilities during official briefings had created doubt about approved systems and procedures among personnel who lacked the technical background necessary to evaluate her. Clings independently. This uncertainty undermined the confidence essential for effective military operations and created divisions within the squadron that threatened operational readiness. More troubling from Harrison's perspective was Rachel's apparent inability to accept guidance and direction from legitimate authority. Despite clear instructions to focus on standard training objectives rather than independent analysis, Rachel continued to pursue her controversial research and share her conclusions with other personnel. Her persistence suggested either deliberate defiance of lawful orders or fundamental misunderstanding of military discipline and command authority. Harrison's phone rang with an unexpected call from Brigadier General Patricia Williams at North American Aerospace Defense Command Headquarters. The general's tone carried the kind of professional formality that preceded difficult conversations about personnel management and operational decisions. General Williams had received additional reports about Rachel's analysis through unofficial channels, creating the kind of higher-level attention that Harrison had hoped to avoid through local management of the situation. The general's questions focused on the specific details of Rachel's personnel evaluation and the reasoning behind Harrison's assessment of her performance and suitability for continued service. Williams had reviewed Rachel's technical qualifications and service record, both of which suggested exceptional competence rather than the problematic performance that Harrison's evaluation described. The apparent contradiction between Rachel's documented capabilities and her current evaluation required explanation and justification. Harrison found himself defending personnel decisions that reflected his assessment of institutional requirements rather than individual technical competence. Rachel's engineering expertise and analytical capabilities were undeniable, but her application of those capabilities in ways that questioned approved systems and procedures made her a disruptive influence. Regardless of her technical accuracy, military effectiveness required unity and confidence in established capabilities, qualities that Rachel's persistent questioning undermined. General Williams listened carefully to Harrison's explanation, but her follow-up questions revealed skepticism about using personnel evaluations to suppress technical expertise that might prove operationally valuable. The general's experience with intelligence failures and system breakdowns had taught her that organizational health required mechanisms for recognizing and addressing valid concerns, regardless of their source or popularity. Dismissing technical expertise because it produced uncomfortable conclusions could prove more dangerous than the disruption it might cause. The conversation concluded with General Williams's guidance that personnel evaluations should reflect actual performance rather than institutional convenience, and that technical expertise should be valued regardless of whether it supported popular assumptions about organizational capabilities. Her final comment was particularly pointed. Military leaders who suppressed valid warnings about operational vulnerabilities might find themselves explaining preventable failures to congressional oversight committees and family members of casualties. After ending the call, Harrison reviewed Rachel's evaluation with new awareness of the broader implications of his personnel decisions. General Williams's guidance created a dilemma between his assessment of institutional requirements and the possibility that Rachel's warnings might prove prophetic. Supporting Rachel's concerns would require acknowledging limitations in systems that represented billions of dollars in investment and years of strategic planning, while dismissing her analysis risk responsibility for preventable failures. The Colonel's review of intelligence reports from the past week revealed patterns that supported several of Rachel's predictions about foreign reconnaissance activities and electronic warfare capabilities. Enemy probe flights were indeed targeting the same system integration points that Rachel had identified as potential vulnerabilities, and their tactics demonstrated exactly the kind of sophisticated electronic warfare techniques that her analysis had warned against. The correlation between her predictions and observable enemy behavior was becoming difficult to dismiss. Harrison's dilemma reflected broader challenges facing military leaders who needed to balance individual expertise with organizational requirements for confidence and unity. Rachel's technical analysis might prove accurate, but implementing her recommendations would require acknowledging fundamental limitations in systems that represented the pinnacle of American military technology. Such acknowledgement could undermine confidence in approved capabilities while raising questions about strategic decisions made at much higher levels. The Colonel spent the afternoon reviewing personnel policies and evaluation procedures, searching for approaches that would address Rachel's disruptive influence while avoiding the kind of obvious retaliation that could generate additional scrutiny from higher headquarters. Military personnel law provided multiple mechanisms for managing problematic officers, but using those mechanisms required careful documentation and justification that could withstand review by senior leaders and legal authorities. Harrison's solution involved reassigning Rachel to administrative duties that would remove her from operational positions, while maintaining the appearance of normal career progression. The reassignment would be justified through standard rotation, policies, and professional development requirements, making it difficult to characterize as retaliation for her technical analysis or unofficial intelligence activities. The transfer would effectively silence her warnings while avoiding the obvious personnel actions that might attract unwanted attention. The reassignment orders were drafted with careful attention to official justifications and procedural requirements. Rachel would be transferred to a staff position at headquarters, where her engineering expertise could be applied to equipment evaluation and technical analysis, responsibilities that would keep her away from operational planning and squadron activities. The transfer would appear to recognize her technical qualifications, while actually removing her influence from areas where her warnings might affect operational decisions. Harrison's personnel management strategy reflected institutional patterns of dealing with individuals whose expertise contradicted popular assumptions about organizational capabilities. Rather than directly confronting technical arguments or acknowledging potential vulnerabilities, the strategy focused on removing disruptive influences through administrative mechanisms that maintained plausible deniability. The approach preserved institutional confidence in approved systems while eliminating sources of doubt and questioning. Lieutenant Colonel James Anderson, who served as deputy commander, reviewed the reassignment orders with professional understanding of their actual purpose despite their official justification. Anderson's experience with personnel management had taught him to recognize the difference between legitimate career development and strategic removal of problematic officers. Rachel's transfer represented the latter, designed to address institutional concerns rather than individual professional needs. The deputy commander's private conversation with Harrison revealed broader concerns about the precedent being established through Rachel's treatment. Anderson understood the importance of maintaining unit cohesion and confidence in approved capabilities, but he also recognized that dismissing technical expertise could prove catastrophic if that expertise proved accurate. The military's institutional health required mechanisms for recognizing and addressing valid concerns, regardless of their source or institutional convenience. Anderson's concerns reflected growing awareness among experienced officers that institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths could create the kind of organizational blindness that preceded major failures. Historical examples of military disasters often included patterns of ignored warnings and suppressed expertise that might have prevented catastrophic outcomes. The challenge was maintaining institutional confidence while ensuring that valid technical concerns received appropriate consideration and response. As Harrison finalized Rachel's reassignment orders, he reflected on the broader implications of personnel decisions that prioritized institutional harmony over individual expertise. Military organizations necessarily emphasized unity and confidence in approved capabilities, but these requirements could become counterproductive when they prevented valid technical knowledge from contributing to operational readiness. The question was whether institutional learning would occur through gradual recognition of expertise or through crisis that made suppressed knowledge essential for organizational survival. The evening briefing that concluded Harrison's administrative day made no mention of Rachel's impending reassignment or the intelligence reports that supported her warnings about defensive vulnerabilities. Official presentations continued to emphasize confidence in integrated defense capabilities while avoiding discussion of demonstrated threats and system limitations. The institutional narrative remained focused on technological superiority and operational readiness despite mounting evidence of sophisticated adversary capabilities and defensive weaknesses. The emergency klaxon at Falcon Ridge Air Force Base shattered the pre-dawn silence with 3 long blasts followed by 4 short ones, the specific sequence that indicated incoming air threats requiring immediate defensive response. Captain Rachel Torres jolted awake in her quarters, instantly recognizing the alert pattern that she had hoped never to hear during actual operations. The digital clock beside her bed showed 0347 hours as she rolled out of bed and reached for the flight suit that every pilot kept ready for emergency scrambles. The base communication system crackled to life with urgent announcements, directing all available aircrew to report immediately to the Squadron Operations Center for emergency briefing and mission assignment. Rachel's training took over as she dressed rapidly while listening to the continuous stream of status, updates, and coordination messages that filled the facility's public address system. The tone and urgency of the communications suggested that this was not a drill or training exercise. Rachel's quick walk across the darkened base revealed the controlled chaos of a military installation responding to genuine crisis. Security forces had established additional checkpoints and expanded patrol areas, while maintenance personnel rushed to prepare aircraft for immediate launch. Ground crews swarmed around the F-35A Lightning IIs that represented Falcon Ridge's primary defensive capability, their movements illuminated by portable floodlights that turned the flight line into a brilliantly lit stage for urgent activity. The Squadron Operations Center buzzed with intense activity as pilots, intelligence analysts, and communications specialists coordinated responses to a rapidly developing threat situation. Multiple display screens showed radar tracks and electronic intelligence data that painted a disturbing picture of coordinated penetration attempts across several sectors of the northern border region. Rachel counted at least 20 distinct radar contacts approaching American airspace from multiple vectors, suggesting a sophisticated multi-axis attack designed to overwhelm defensive responses. Colonel Harrison stood before the main tactical display, his expression reflecting the gravity of a situation that had moved far beyond routine training exercises and normal operational activities. The morning's intelligence briefing revealed that foreign reconnaissance flights over the past month had been preparation for this coordinated penetration attempt involving 2295 Bear bombers approaching from carefully planned routes designed to exploit weaknesses in radar coverage and defensive coordination. The colonel's initial assessment emphasized the capabilities of their integrated defense network and the technological superiority of their F-35 fighters in responding to this unprecedented threat. Automated systems had detected the incoming aircraft and calculated optimal intercept courses for each defensive patrol, while networked communications provided real-time coordination between multiple defensive sectors. The response plan relied heavily on the seamless integration between sensors, communication networks, and advanced fighter capabilities. Rachel listened to the briefing with growing concern about aspects of the threat picture that weren't being addressed in official planning. Her months of analysis had identified specific vulnerabilities in their integrated defense network that sophisticated adversaries could exploit during coordinated attacks. The current threat scenario showed every indication of being designed to target exactly those vulnerabilities through electronic warfare and cyber attacks that could disable defensive coordination. The intelligence summary revealed that the incoming bombers were accompanied by sophisticated electronic warfare platforms that had already begun jamming satellite communications and introducing false signals into radar networks. These attacks were targeting the network integration protocols that made modern air defense systems vulnerable to cascading failures. Exactly the scenario that Rachel's analysis had predicted and her recommended backup procedures were designed to prevent. As pilots received their mission assignments, Rachel raised her hand to address potential complications from electronic warfare attacks and communication failures. Her attempt to share critical information about defensive vulnerabilities was immediately cut short by Colonel Harrison's sharp reminder that this was an operational briefing rather than a forum for theoretical discussions. The Colonel's focus remained on executing the approved response plan, using integrated defense capabilities rather than considering alternative approaches. Rachel's frustration mounted as she watched the briefing proceed without acknowledging the electronic warfare threats that were already affecting their defensive systems. Communication links with higher headquarters were experiencing intermittent failures that suggested successful enemy jamming operations, while radar displays showed anomalous readings that indicated sophisticated deception techniques designed to mask actual aircraft positions and numbers. The mission assignments reflected Colonel Harrison's confidence in technological solutions and integrated defense capabilities. F-35 pilots received vectors to intercept incoming bombers, using automated guidance systems and network targeting information, while ground-based radar systems provided continuous updates about threat positions and movements. The plan assumed that electronic warfare attacks would have minimal impact on advanced systems designed to operate in contested environments. Rachel's assigned mission involved flying backup support in her F-16, a role that reflected her marginalized status within the squadron rather than recognition of her technical expertise and analytical capabilities. The older aircraft was considered less capable than the advanced F-35s that would conduct primary intercept missions, despite its proven reliability and independence from the network systems that were showing signs of electronic warfare degradation. As the briefing concluded and pilots rushed toward their aircraft, Rachel attempted to share her analysis of defensive vulnerabilities with fellow pilots who would be conducting intercept missions. Her warnings about communication failures and radar deception techniques were met with polite dismissal and reassurance that modern systems could handle any conceivable electronic warfare threats. The institutional confidence in technological solutions remained unshaken despite mounting evidence of successful enemy attacks on those systems. Lieutenant Mark Chen, who was assigned to lead one of the intercept flights, expressed typical confidence in F-35 capabilities and integrated defense networks. Chen's training had emphasized the technological advantages that made American fighters superior to any potential adversary, and he viewed Rachel's concerns about system vulnerabilities as unnecessary pessimism that could undermine pilot confidence during critical operations. Captain David Murphy, who would fly wing position with Chen, shared similar confidence in their advanced capabilities while acknowledging Rachel's technical expertise in more diplomatic terms. Murphy's experience with Rachel had taught him to respect her analytical skills, but the current crisis required focus on executing approved procedures. rather than considering alternative approaches that might confuse coordination and reduce effectiveness. Master Sergeant Kim, who was monitoring radar systems from the ground perspective, observed the same electronic warfare effects that Rachel had predicted in her analysis. Communication links were experiencing degradation that suggested successful jamming operations, while radar displays showed false contacts and signal distortion that indicated sophisticated deception techniques. Kim's attempts to report these problems through normal channels were met with assurance that backup systems would compensate for any temporary difficulties. The pattern of institutional resistance to uncomfortable intelligence continued even as that intelligence was being validated by observable enemy actions. Electronic warfare attacks were affecting defensive systems exactly as Rachel's analysis had predicted, but operational planning remained focused on technological solutions that were proving vulnerable to sophisticated adversary capabilities. The crisis was unfolding according to scenarios that had been dismissed as unlikely despite their technical accuracy. Rachel's walk to her aircraft reflected growing awareness that institutional dynamics were preventing critical knowledge from influencing defensive responses during the most important mission of her career. Her analysis had predicted the current threat scenario with remarkable accuracy, but that prescience remained professionally irrelevant as long as institutional momentum favored confidence in approved capabilities over individual expertise in alternative approaches. Staff Sergeant Johnson, who was preparing Rachel's F-16 for immediate launch, had observed equipment performance anomalies that correlated with the electronic warfare attacks affecting base communications and radar systems. Johnson's maintenance expertise allowed her to recognize degradation in aircraft systems that less experienced personnel might dismiss as normal operational variation, but her concerns about equipment reliability weren't considered relevant to immediate operational requirements. The aircraft preparation process revealed additional evidence of electronic warfare effects as radio systems experienced interference and navigation equipment showed accuracy degradation that suggested GPS jamming operations. These problems affected all aircraft equally, but the F-35's greater dependence on network systems made them more vulnerable to coordination failures and mission degradation despite their advanced capabilities. As Rachel completed her pre-flight checks and prepared for takeoff, she realized that the crisis she had long predicted was beginning to unfold exactly as her analysis had suggested. Electronic warfare attacks were degrading defensive coordination while sophisticated penetration tactics exploited vulnerabilities in integrated systems, creating exactly the kind of scenario where manual backup procedures and independent capabilities would prove essential for successful defensive operations. The piercing wail of the scramble alarm continued to echo across Falcon Ridge as Rachel completed her pre-flight checks with methodical precision, despite the urgency surrounding her. Through her cockpit canopy, she could see ground crews frantically preparing the F-35 Lightning IIs for immediate launch, while electronic displays throughout the base flickered with intermittent malfunctions that suggested successful enemy jamming operations. The very systems that Colonel Harrison had touted as invulnerable were already showing signs of degradation under coordinated electronic warfare attacks. Rachel's radio crackled with fragments of communication as pilots attempted to coordinate their response through increasingly unreliable communication networks. The integrated defense system that was supposed to provide seamless coordination between multiple aircraft and ground control was experiencing exactly the kind of cascading failures that her analysis had predicted. Satellite communication links were being jammed intermittently, creating gaps in information flow that prevented effective coordination between defensive elements. Master Sergeant Kim's voice cut through the radio static with urgent updates about radar system performance and electronic warfare effects that were degrading their ability to track incoming threats accurately. His reports confirmed Rachel's worst fears about the vulnerability of network systems to sophisticated jamming operations, But his warnings were being dismissed by controllers who maintained confidence in backup procedures that existed more in theory than in operational reality. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson's voice emerged from the communication chaos with launch authorization for the primary intercept flight led by Lieutenant Chen and Captain Murphy. The two F-35 pilots acknowledged their orders while reporting intermittent problems with their integrated targeting systems and communication links to ground control. Their advanced aircraft were experiencing the kind of network dependency issues that Rachel had warned about for months, but operational momentum prevented acknowledgement of these problems. Rachel keyed her radio to request permission to address the electronic warfare problems that were affecting defensive coordination, but her transmission was immediately cut off by Colonel Harrison's sharp reminder that all personnel should maintain radio discipline and follow established procedures. The colonel's emphasis on standardized responses reflected institutional confidence in approved capabilities despite mounting evidence that those capabilities were being systematically degraded by enemy action. The launch sequence proceeded according to established procedures while electronic warfare attacks continued to degrade the systems that those procedures depended upon. F-35 pilots reported navigation anomalies and targeting system malfunctions that suggested GPS jamming and radar deception operations, but these reports were attributed to temporary technical difficulties rather than coordinated enemy action designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in advanced systems. Rachel's attempts to share critical information about alternative navigation techniques and manual backup procedures were repeatedly interrupted by instructions to maintain standard communication protocols and avoid unauthorized transmissions. Her knowledge of the terrain features and radar coverage patterns that could compensate for electronic warfare effects remained professionally irrelevant as long as institutional momentum favored technological solutions over individual expertise. The primary intercept flight launched into increasingly contested airspace while communication links with ground control experienced progressive degradation that prevented effective coordination and target assignment. Lieutenant Chun's F-35 disappeared from radar displays intermittently as electronic warfare attacks created false signals and masking effects that confused automated tracking systems, but ground controllers maintained confidence that technical problems would resolve themselves through system redundancy. Captain Murphy's aircraft experienced similar tracking difficulties while his communication attempts were interrupted by jamming operations that prevented coordination with his flight leader and ground control. The integrated defense network that was supposed to provide superior situational awareness and coordination was proving vulnerable to exactly the kind of sophisticated electronic warfare techniques that foreign reconnaissance flights had been testing for weeks. Rachel monitored the deteriorating situation from her position in the backup flight while Colonel Harrison continued to emphasize confidence in approved capabilities and resistance to alternative approaches. Her detailed knowledge of manual navigation techniques and terrain-based targeting methods remained unused while pilots struggled with degraded systems and reduced coordination capabilities that made their advanced aircraft less effective than their technological advantages suggested. The crisis reached a critical point when Lieutenant Chun's aircraft disappeared from all tracking systems simultaneously, suggesting either catastrophic equipment failure or successful enemy deception. Operations that masked his actual position and status. Ground control's attempts to re-establish contact were unsuccessful due to communication jamming that prevented normal coordination procedures, creating exactly the kind of information blackout that Rachel's backup procedures were designed to prevent. Master Sergeant Kim's increasingly urgent reports about radar system failures and communication breakdowns were being dismissed as temporary technical difficulties rather than systematic degradation caused by coordinated electronic warfare attacks. His expertise with defensive systems allowed him to recognize enemy tactics that were specifically designed to exploit network integration vulnerabilities. But his warnings carried little weight compared to institutional confidence in technological solutions. Captain Murphy's situation reports painted a disturbing picture of an intercept mission that was failing due to system degradation rather than enemy superiority in aircraft performance or pilot capability. His F-35's advanced sensors were being confused by electronic deception operations, while communication failures prevented coordination with other defensive elements, creating isolation and confusion that reduced mission effectiveness despite technological advantages. Rachel's radio requests for permission to provide navigation assistance and communication relay capabilities were denied by Colonel Harrison's insistence on maintaining established procedures and avoiding unauthorized coordination that might confuse an already complex situation. The Colonel's focus on standardized responses prevented utilization of alternative capabilities that might compensate for system failures and electronic warfare effects. The developing crisis validated every concern that Rachel had raised about defensive vulnerabilities and the need for backup procedures that operated independently of network systems. Electronic warfare attacks were successfully degrading integrated defense capabilities, while sophisticated penetration tactics exploited exactly the weaknesses that her analysis had identified. The institutional resistance to her warnings was proving catastrophic as predicted scenarios unfolded with devastating accuracy. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, who was monitoring communications from the ground control perspective, watched the systematic failure of technological solutions that military leadership had proclaimed invulnerable to enemy action. Her engineering background allowed her to understand the technical details of network failures and electronic warfare effects that were degrading defensive coordination, but her junior status prevented her from influencing operational responses to the developing crisis. The pattern of institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths continued even as those truths were being validated by operational failures and enemy successes. Electronic warfare attacks were affecting defensive systems exactly as Rachel's analysis had predicted, but command emphasis remained on technological solutions that were proving inadequate to counter sophisticated adversary capabilities and coordinated electronic attack operations. Staff Sergeant Johnson's maintenance monitoring revealed progressive degradation in aircraft systems that correlated with electronic warfare, attacks affecting base communications and radar networks. Her technical expertise with equipment performance allowed her to recognize jamming effects and system interference that less experienced personnel might dismiss as routine operational anomalies, but her observations weren't considered relevant to immediate tactical decision-making. As the crisis deepened and communication with the primary intercept flight became increasingly intermittent, Rachel realized that institutional dynamics were preventing critical knowledge from influencing defensive responses during the most serious threat scenario her unit had ever faced. Her expertise in alternative navigation methods and manual backup procedures remained professionally irrelevant, while technologically advanced aircraft struggled with degraded systems and reduced coordination capabilities. The morning that had begun with institutional confidence in integrated defense networks and technological superiority was evolving into a demonstration of the catastrophic consequences that could result from dismissing individual expertise and ignoring warnings about system vulnerabilities. Rachel's analysis had predicted this scenario with remarkable accuracy, but that prescience remained institutionally unwelcome as long as command emphasis favored approved capabilities over alternative approaches to defensive operations. Communications chaos at Falcon Ridge reached a crescendo as Lieutenant Chun's F-35 Lightning II vanished completely from all tracking systems, leaving ground control with no information about his position, status, or mission progress. The silence that followed his last fragmented transmission created a vacuum of uncertainty that exposed the fatal dependence of modern air defense on network systems that sophisticated adversaries could systematically disable through coordinated electronic warfare attacks. Master Sergeant Kim's radar displays showed a nightmarish landscape of false contacts, ghost signals, and tracking anomalies that made accurate threat assessment impossible through normal procedures. The integrated defense network that Colonel Harrison had championed as invulnerable was proving catastrophically vulnerable to exactly the kind of electronic deception operations that Rachel's analysis had warned against for months. Enemy aircraft were exploiting coverage gaps and system failures with the precision of forces that had studied American defensive capabilities extensively. Captain Murphy's increasingly desperate situation reports painted a picture of technological failure that contradicted every assumption about American air superiority and defensive capabilities. His F-35's advanced sensors were being systematically confused by electronic warfare techniques that turned technological advantages into operational liabilities, while communication failures prevented coordination with other defensive elements and ground control facilities. The 2295 Bear bombers that had initially appeared as distinct radar contacts were now presenting as dozens of false targets intermixed with authentic aircraft signatures, creating confusion that made effective intercept operations impossible. Through standard procedures, the enemy's electronic warfare capabilities were demonstrating mastery of American system vulnerabilities that suggested years of careful study and preparation for exactly this kind of coordinated penetration operation. Rachel watched the systematic collapse of defensive coordination from her position in the backup flight, her F-16's older systems providing clearer situational awareness than the advanced F-35s that were struggling with network dependency and electronic interference. Her aircraft's independence from integrated systems that were being jammed made it paradoxically more capable than supposedly superior platforms that relied heavily on network coordination and satellite communications. Colonel Harrison's command center operated in crisis mode as staff officers struggled to maintain coordination through communication systems that were experiencing progressive degradation. The colonel's confidence in technological solutions remained unshaken despite mounting evidence that those solutions were failing catastrophically under enemy electronic warfare attacks. His orders continued to emphasize standard procedures and approved capabilities while the foundation of those procedures crumbled under sophisticated adversary action. The situation deteriorated further when Captain Murphy's aircraft also disappeared from tracking systems, leaving ground control with no information about either primary interceptor's location or mission status. The loss of contact with both F-35s created a tactical vacuum that exposed the inadequacy of backup procedures that existed more in theory than in operational reality. Years of confidence in technological superiority had prevented development of alternative capabilities that could function independently of networked systems. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez, monitoring communications from the Intelligence Center, recognized the unfolding disaster as validation of every concern that Rachel had raised about defensive vulnerabilities and system dependencies. The electronic warfare attacks were following patterns that Rachel's analysis had predicted with disturbing accuracy, but institutional resistance to uncomfortable truths had prevented implementation of countermeasures that might have maintained defensive effectiveness. Master Sergeant Kim's attempts to provide alternative tracking information using manual plotting techniques were hampered by the systematic dismantling of procedures that previous generations of operators had considered essential backup capabilities. The focus on technological integration had eliminated redundant systems and manual procedures that could have compensated for network failures, creating single points of failure that sophisticated adversaries could exploit with devastating effectiveness. The enemy aircraft continued their penetration deeper into American airspace while defensive responses remained paralyzed by system failures and communication breakdowns. The 295 bombers were approaching critical infrastructure and population centers that their reconnaissance flights had identified as high-value targets, while American defenders struggled with degraded capabilities that made effective interception increasingly unlikely. Staff Sergeant Johnson's maintenance monitoring revealed that aircraft systems throughout the base were experiencing interference effects that correlated with the electronic warfare, attacks affecting communications, and radar networks. Her technical expertise allowed her to recognize jamming signatures and system degradation that suggested coordinated attacks on multiple electronic systems simultaneously. But her observations weren't being integrated into tactical decision-making processes. The crisis exposed fundamental flaws in military planning that had prioritized technological advancement over operational resilience and system redundancy. Decades of investment in integrated networks and advanced capabilities had created defensive architectures that were impressively capable under normal conditions, but catastrophically vulnerable to sophisticated electronic warfare attacks that targeted their fundamental dependencies. Rachel's requests for permission to attempt contact with the missing pilots using alternative communication methods were denied by Colonel Harrison's insistence on maintaining standard procedures despite their obvious failure. The Colonel's commitment to approved capabilities prevented utilization of backup techniques that might restore communication and coordination with defensive elements that were struggling with system degradation. The developing disaster validated every prediction that Rachel had made about the consequences of over-reliance on technological solutions without adequate backup procedures and alternative capabilities. Electronic warfare attacks were successfully exploiting network vulnerabilities, while sophisticated penetration tactics took advantage of defensive confusion and coordination failures that could have been prevented through proper contingency planning. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson watched the crisis unfold with growing awareness that institutional resistance to uncomfortable warnings was contributing to preventable failures that could have catastrophic consequences. His experience with personnel management had taught him to recognize the difference between disruptive questioning and valid technical concerns, but institutional momentum had prevented proper evaluation of Rachel's analysis until crisis made prevention impossible. The enemy bombers continued their advance while American defensive responses remained hampered by system failures and communication breakdowns that demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of institutional overconfidence in technological solutions. The reconnaissance flights that had probed American defenses for weeks had been preparation for exactly this kind of coordinated attack that exploited identified vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Ground control's attempts to coordinate defensive responses through backup communication systems revealed the inadequacy of alternative procedures that had been neglected in favor of integrated networks that were now failing under enemy attack. Years of confidence in primary systems had prevented development of robust backup capabilities that could maintain operational effectiveness when sophisticated adversaries targeted technological dependencies. The situation reached its nadir when radar tracking indicated that enemy aircraft had successfully penetrated to within striking distance of major population centers and critical infrastructure, while American defensive responses remained paralyzed by technological failures and coordination breakdowns. The scenario that Rachel had warned about was unfolding with devastating accuracy, but institutional mechanisms for acknowledging and responding to such warnings had proven inadequate until crisis made prevention impossible. Rachel's F-16 remained operational and capable, while more advanced aircraft struggled with system degradation and communication failures, demonstrating the value of technological diversity and backup capabilities that institutional planning had systematically eliminated. Her aircraft's independence from network systems made it paradoxically more effective than supposedly superior platforms that depended on coordination networks that sophisticated adversaries could disable. The moment of decision arrived when Rachel's radio crackled with a fragmentary transmission from Captain Murphy's F-35, the first contact with either missing pilot in over 20 minutes. Murphy's voice carried the strain of someone fighting both technological failure and mounting desperation as he reported his position deep in contested airspace with degraded systems that made navigation and target identification nearly impossible. His situation exemplified the catastrophic vulnerability of advanced systems to sophisticated electronic warfare attacks. Murphy's transmission revealed that he had lost contact with Lieutenant Chun completely and was operating blind through electronic interference that rendered his advanced sensors useless for tactical purposes. His F-35's integration with networked systems had become a liability rather than an advantage. His enemy jamming operations turned technological sophistication into operational confusion. The pilot's training had emphasized technological solutions that were proving inadequate against adversaries who had studied American capabilities extensively. Rachel listened to Murphy's increasingly desperate situation reports, while Colonel Harrison maintained his insistence on standard procedures and approved responses, despite their obvious failure to address the developing crisis. The colonel's orders continued to emphasize confidence in integrated systems and technological capabilities, while those same systems failed catastrophically under coordinated enemy attack. His institutional commitment to approved solutions prevented recognition of alternative approaches that might restore defensive effectiveness. The breaking point came when Murphy reported that enemy aircraft were proceeding toward major population centers while American defensive responses remained paralyzed by communication failures and system degradation. His F-35 was capable of intercepting the threat, but only if he could receive navigation assistance and target information through alternative methods that bypassed the compromised networks that standard procedures depended upon. Rachel realized that institutional protocols were preventing effective response to a crisis that threatened thousands of civilian lives and critical national infrastructure. Her knowledge of manual navigation techniques and alternative communication methods could provide the coordination necessary for successful interception, but only if she violated direct orders and abandoned approved procedures that were proving inadequate under enemy electronic warfare attacks. The decision to act outside established authority required accepting personal responsibility for consequences that could include court-martial, imprisonment, and complete destruction of her military career. Rachel understood that military discipline and institutional authority were essential for organizational effectiveness, but she also recognized that blind adherence to failed procedures during genuine crisis constituted a betrayal of the oath she had sworn to defend American lives and territory. Master Sergeant Kim's voice cut through the radio interference with urgent updates about enemy aircraft positions that he was tracking through manual plotting techniques that bypassed compromised electronic systems. His expertise with traditional radar operation provided tactical information that automated systems could no longer deliver reliably, but his reports weren't being integrated into coordination efforts that remained focused on technological solutions. Rachel made her choice with the clarity that came from technical knowledge, operational experience, and moral certainty about the consequences of inaction. She keyed her radio to establish contact with Murphy using communication frequencies and procedures that operated independently of the compromised networks that standard protocols relied upon. Her transmission bypassed Colonel Harrison's command authority while providing critical navigation assistance that could restore defensive effectiveness. Murphy's response to Rachel's contact demonstrated the relief of a pilot who had been operating in technological isolation while facing threats that required coordination and support for successful resolution. Rachel's alternative communication methods provided the first reliable contact he had experienced since entering contested airspace, offering navigation assistance and tactical information that his compromised systems could no longer provide independently. The manual navigation techniques that Rachel had developed through months of terrain analysis and electronic warfare study proved essential for guiding Murphy through airspace where GPS systems were being jammed in electronic deception operations created false navigation signals. Her detailed knowledge of geographic features and radar coverage patterns provided reference points that remained reliable when technological aids failed under enemy attack. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez monitored Rachel's unauthorized communications from the intelligence center with growing awareness that institutional resistance to alternative approaches was being overcome by operational necessity and individual courage. Rodriguez's engineering background allowed her to understand the technical superiority of Rachel's manual methods under electronic warfare conditions, but her junior status prevented her from officially supporting violations of established procedures. Staff Sergeant Johnson observed Rachel's F-16 maneuvering with the precision that came from intimate knowledge of aircraft capabilities and operational environment, rather than dependence on automated systems that were being systematically degraded by enemy action. Johnson's maintenance expertise allowed her to recognize superior piloting skills that were being demonstrated through crisis conditions that exposed the difference between technological dependence and genuine competence. Rachel's guidance enabled Murphy to navigate through electronic interference toward enemy aircraft that were approaching critical targets while American defensive coordination remained paralyzed by system failures and communication breakdowns. Her alternative methods provided tactical information and navigation assistance that restored Murphy's operational effectiveness, despite the degradation of his advanced systems under sophisticated electronic warfare attacks. The coordination between Rachel's manual techniques and Murphy's F-35 capabilities demonstrated the potential effectiveness of hybrid approaches that combined technological advantages with backup procedures that operated independently of vulnerable networks. Their partnership validated the analytical conclusions that Rachel had been advocating for months while providing practical demonstration of alternative methods that could maintain defensive effectiveness under adverse conditions. Colonel Harrison's attempts to regain command control over unauthorized communications were frustrated by the same electronic warfare attacks that had degraded official coordination procedures. His orders to cease unauthorized activities couldn't be transmitted reliably through compromised networks, creating ironic situations where institutional authority was being defeated by the same technological vulnerabilities that individual initiative was successfully circumventing. Lieutenant Colonel Anderson watched the developing situation with professional understanding of the institutional crisis that was unfolding alongside the tactical emergency. Rachel's violation of orders was providing operational effectiveness that approved procedures had failed to deliver, creating precedents that challenged fundamental assumptions about military discipline and technological dependence that could have far-reaching implications for future operations. Master Sergeant Kim's manual tracking provided continuous updates about enemy aircraft movements that automated systems could no longer deliver reliably, demonstrating the value of traditional skills that institutional modernization had systematically eliminated. His expertise with manual plotting techniques proved essential for maintaining situational awareness when sophisticated adversaries targeted the technological systems that modern operations depended upon. The unauthorized coordination between Rachel and Murphy began to restore defensive effectiveness as alternative methods compensated for network failures and electronic warfare attacks that had paralyzed approved procedures. Their success demonstrated that technological sophistication without adequate backup capabilities created vulnerabilities that sophisticated adversaries could exploit with devastating consequences, while hybrid approaches that maintained traditional skills alongside modern capabilities provided operational resilience. Rachel's decision to violate direct orders in order to save lives and restore defensive effectiveness represented the kind of individual moral courage that institutional systems were designed to channel and control rather than suppress. Her technical expertise and operational judgment were proving superior to institutional procedures that had failed under enemy attack. But her methods required accepting personal responsibility for consequences that could destroy her career regardless of operational success. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.